Welcome back to this beginning runner's course. In this video, we're gonna talk about the most important aspect of running, and that is running consistency. It's all about loading, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a second. But first off, I wanna share a little bit of how we can use the same principles as weightlifters to become better runners. So most of us have been to the gym at some point in our lives and seen those enormous meathead guys with biceps that are bigger around than my legs, and it's no surprise to anyone how that happened. It didn't happen by accident, and they weren't born that way. They used steroids. Just joking. These guys were very intentionally exposing their muscles to greater and greater loads by lifting these heavy weights over and over again. Even if they did use steroids, they could never have gotten big like they are without the consistent loading and rebuilding of their muscles. But the interesting thing is they didn't start with heavy weights. They started small and slowly built up to it as their bodies adapted. When a muscle gets bigger from that kind of work, it's called hypertrophy. And when it gets smaller because you haven't been working it very hard, it's called atrophy. Now, pretty much everybody knows about this, but what a lot of people don't realize is that it's not just muscles that do this. A very similar thing happens to bones, cartilage, and ligaments. When you expose your bones to heavy load through lifting weights or repeated pounding as you run, the bone actually rebuilds itself back thicker and builds extra crossbeams on the inside to support those kinds of stresses. And when you stress tendons or ligaments, a really similar thing happens, and those connective tissues get stronger. Now, if you're a weightlifter and you're doing a lift that's too heavy for you, a couple things can happen. Number one, it's just gonna be too heavy, and try as you might, you won't be able to move it. Or two, maybe you can move it, or maybe you can even do the lift, but your form will be really bad and you'll be swinging the weight to try to get it up, and maybe you get injured. So with running, it's a little less obvious. As a runner, you have pretty much the same load on your muscle and bones every time you take a step, whether you're a novice or whether you've been running for a long time. But the thing that changes is how many steps you're taking, how fast you run, and your form. Before I was in physical therapy school, I liked to run a lot, and I would run a little every day. But for those 3 years in my doctoral program, I ended up running like once a week and then like once a month, if that. And toward the end of my program, I decided I wanted to start being consistent at running again. And I have a friend, and we would run together, and one day I was at his house, and he told me that on Monday he had run a marathon distance, 26.2 miles. And I was really competitive, and so I was really cool about it. I was like, oh yeah, that's not that impressive. But in my mind, I was like, dang it, I really need to run a marathon now. So as he was telling me this, I was literally just finishing eating an entire Little Caesars pizza. I'm stuffed to the gills with pepperoni and cheese, and I decide I'm gonna run a marathon right now. So I laced up my shoes, I chugged a bunch of water, and I hit the road. And I hope from what we've been talking about that this story makes you a little queasy, and not just because of the pizza bouncing around in my stomach, but because basically what I did is the equivalent of if I'm a novice weightlifter and I'm gonna go try to lift the same weights as the guys in the strongman competition. It was so far above what my body was prepared for at the time that I was almost certain to get injured. And I did finish it, but I had to walk a lot, and when I was done, my body just felt like it was in shambles. My feet were swollen, it was excruciating to stand up, and every time I moved my legs, it felt like someone was stabbing a giant knife in my butt. I do not exaggerate to say that it was 3 months later before I felt like I could run at all again. And I know you're all thinking, well, that was really stupid, but I would never do something like that. But the reason I tell you this story is because most running injuries happen because of loading issues, a lot like this. This is an extreme example, but things like this happen all the time. A runner starts putting more miles in only to discover, ow, my foot really is killing me, or ow, the outside of my knee is hurting a ton when I run, or dang, my hips feel weak and painful when I run. So many of those issues are because of loading problems. And there's that word again, loading. I promised I would explain what I mean by that. When I talk about a loading issue or a loading injury, what I mean by that is that the force that was applied to a particular body part, or as I call it, a body tissue, was applied too much too soon. Now that can mean you lifted too much weight for what you were ready for, but in the case of running, it usually means you ran too long, too far, or too fast for what you were ready for. And here's what you really need to know. When it comes to loading injuries, it's about consistency. The greatest bane of recreational runners is that lack of consistency because it so often leads to injury. If the weightlifter can slowly build up to those heavy weights, they'll be okay. But if they work out once, they take a lot of time off, they're not really consistent, they won't be able to build up the muscle that's necessary to lift those heavy weights. But with running, in some ways, it's a little more tempting for someone to bite off more than they can chew because they physically can probably do it. It's just that there's going to be harsh consequences for your body. And those consequences sometimes show up days or weeks later, and that can make it feel like the injury just happened to you, when in reality, we have a lot more control than we think we do. So for runners, it's extra important that we hammer home this idea of being consistent in your training. I personally like the strategy of running every day. I do take one day a week off, and not every day is the same distance or intensity, but for the most part, I try to do it every day. I know a lot of people that choose to run every other day, and that's just fine too. Just make sure that whatever you do it consistently. Make it a habit that sticks. So how are we going to apply this idea? Well, we need to start by keeping a running journal, and it doesn't have to take a lot of time, and it can be as simple or as complicated as you want. I have this sheet that you can print off as a part of this running course, and basically it allows you to organize the important data we need to keep track of. So I want you to write down how often you ran last week, and if you can remember the week before that. Also write down how far you ran, and then this one's optional, but helpful. If you want, you can write about the intensity, how fast it was, elevation gain, the type of surfaces, like whether you were on dirt or on asphalt or concrete. The key here is I want you to write as much information as you feel like you can consistently do. If it feels like it might be too much, start with the first two and then just go from there. A lot of runners already have a Fitbit or a phone or something that tracks their distance. If you don't, I want you to write it down. You can use the physical copy like I have, or write it in your notes on your phone or something like that, but the important thing is that you write it down somewhere. Next, using what you wrote down, I want you to decide on an amount of miles that you think is very achievable for you. If you're already running 50 miles a week, maybe that's your number. If you're not running at all right now and you haven't done much running in the past, maybe you need to start off by doing a quarter mile every day, which would add up to be 1.5 miles a week, if you take that one day off like me. This number is going to be your friend in avoiding injuries, and I want you to keep it in mind as you train. It may not be that you do the exact same distance every day. I like to do a long run on Saturday, and then I use Sunday as my recovery day, but overall, the daily numbers in the week should add up to that weekly number that you're shooting for. Let me make a little note here for those of you who have never run before and are pretty inactive. I actually recommend starting out not running at all. I would say build up a solid walking program and apply those same principles to your walking program as you would for running. Find a number of miles you can do a week and build up from there. If you really haven't done much walking or running before, it may be good to do several weeks or even months of walking before you start incorporating little bits of running. When you do move to running, you can apply the same principles. Walk your normal distance, and then for the last 100 yards or whatever you decide, turn it into a run. You can slowly change more and more of your walking into running, but just make sure that you're keeping track of it in your running journal. Little side note for you, if you do a particularly grueling walk or run, I would recommend doing something a little less intense the next day to allow your body to heal. Maybe bring the miles down that next day or take it at a slower pace, and we'll talk more about the recovery process a little bit later. Once you have your weekly mileage, I want you to make a plan for your upcoming week. Decide which days you're gonna run what distance, and then put that schedule somewhere where you will see it. Put it in your calendar on your phone or on your mirror or somewhere where it can remind you to do it. When you move from running when you feel like it to running every day, you're gonna experience resistance. It may start to feel just kind of blah, or maybe you won't be motivated, but it's really important that you still go out and do it, because by doing that daily grind, you're laying the foundation for the victories that you're hoping to achieve in life. But even more importantly, there are these excellent health benefits and mental and cognitive improvements that you'll experience. The last thing I'm gonna talk about with this running journal is this. You can't be so strict about meeting your plan that you won't change it. It's very important to be consistent, but it's also important to listen to your body. You need to learn to pay attention to how you're feeling. Maybe you're feeling sluggish day in and day out, and that could be an indication that you need to decrease your miles and build them up slower than you have been. It's also important to think about your recovery. Maybe you need to get more sleep. Maybe you need to eat more food, and that will almost always be the case as you increase your miles. Remember though, it is possible to be sensitive to your needs while still being consistent. In fact, a lot of times the people who listen to their bodies are able to be the most consistent. A lot of times that means slowing down the pace on days you're feeling tired. The most important thing is being sensitive enough to your body to allow you to do it again tomorrow. Consistency in this principle of loading is such a simple thing, but it really works. If I was only allowed to do one thing for a runner to help them avoid injuries, it would be teaching them how to be consistent and progressive with your training. So that's pretty much the end of this video. Before you move on to the next one, make sure that you have a place to keep this running journal figured out and fill it out with information from your last week of running. Next, make a plan on what your week will be like. And lastly, schedule into your schedule when those runs will be. And a week from now, schedule another planning session because this needs to be a weekly thing where you make a plan for the week. As the weeks go by and you're feeling good, you may start to incrementally increase your distance. But again, be sensitive to yourself and your needs as you do that. So have that planning session with yourself, and I will see you on the next video where we will talk about motivation and how to keep yourself consistent.